Number 1. Instinct. Schopenhauer's philosophy begins with the assertion that women are fundamentally governed by instinct rather than reason. He argued that, unlike men, women are primarily driven by natural impulses and emotional responses, which shape their decisions and behaviors. For Schopenhauer, this instinctual nature was not simply a product of culture or upbringing, but a deep-seated aspect of female biology. He believed that women's actions are motivated by immediate needs and practical concerns, such as security, comfort, and survival, rather than by abstract thought or rational deliberation. This perspective led him to conclude that women are less capable of engaging in philosophical inquiry or higher intellectual pursuits. In his view, the dominance of instinct over reason limited women's potential for moral and intellectual achievement. Schopenhauer saw this as a fundamental difference between the sexes, one that justified, in his mind, the traditional roles assigned to women in society and their exclusion from intellectual life. Number 2. Shallowness. Schopenhauer firmly believed that women lacked the intellectual depth and philosophical ability that he saw as essential to true greatness. In his writings, he argued that women were not naturally inclined toward abstract thinking, critical analysis, or the pursuit of wisdom. Instead, he claimed their minds were more suited to practical matters and everyday concerns. For Schopenhauer, this supposed deficiency was not a result of limited education or social opportunity, but an inherent aspect of female nature. He maintained that women were uninterested in the profound questions that drive philosophy and were incapable of original thought or creative genius. This belief led him to dismiss the possibility of women making significant contributions to art, science, or philosophy. In his view, the lack of intellectual depth among women justified their exclusion from scholarly and philosophical circles, reinforcing the idea that the highest forms of knowledge and creativity were the exclusive domain of men. Number 3. Manipulation. Schopenhauer frequently described women as manipulative and emotionally influential rather than honest or strong. In his analysis, women's primary means of exerting power was not through direct confrontation or physical strength, but through subtle persuasion and emotional leverage. He argued that women possess a natural ability to read the feelings and intentions of others, using this insight to influence outcomes in their favor. For Schopenhauer, this was not a form of wisdom or empathy, but a calculated strategy rooted in self-interest. He believed that women preferred indirect methods, such as charm, flattery, and suggestion, over open communication or straightforward action. This tendency, in his view, was not simply a product of social conditioning, but an inherent aspect of female nature. As a result, Schopenhauer saw women's influence as hidden and often insidious, shaping decisions and relationships from behind the scenes and blurring the distinction between genuine emotion and deliberate manipulation. Number 4. Vanity. Schopenhauer often accused women of being excessively preoccupied with their appearance and social status. In his writings, he argued that women devote a disproportionate amount of attention to how they look, viewing beauty as their primary asset and means of influence. Schopenhauer believed that this focus on physical attractiveness was not merely a cultural phenomenon but a fundamental aspect of female nature rooted in biological drives related to reproduction and survival. He claimed that women's concern with fashion, grooming, and outward presentation was matched by an equally strong desire for social approval and elevated status within their communities. According to Schopenhauer, this preoccupation with vanity and reputation led women to prioritize superficial qualities over deeper intellectual or moral pursuits. He saw this as evidence of a limited worldview, one that valued external validation above personal growth or achievement, and used it to justify his broader critique of women's role in society and culture. Number 5. Biology. Schopenhauer argued that women's behavior was fundamentally dictated by biology, with a particular emphasis on the role of reproduction. He believed that, unlike men, women are primarily motivated by instincts related to the continuation of the species. In his view, every aspect of female behavior, from the desire for security and stability to the pursuit of attractive partners, could be traced back to biological imperatives. Schopenhauer maintained that women's choices and priorities are shaped by the need to ensure the survival and well-being of their offspring, making them more pragmatic and cautious in their actions. He saw this biological focus as limiting, suggesting that it prevented women from aspiring to higher intellectual or creative pursuits. For Schopenhauer, the influence of reproduction on women's lives was not just a matter of personal choice, but an inescapable force of nature. This belief reinforced his conviction that women's roles and capacities were fundamentally different from those of men. Number 6. Short-sightedness. Schopenhauer believed that women are primarily concerned with immediate needs and practical concerns, rather than long-term goals or abstract ambitions. In his view, women's attention is naturally drawn to the present moment, focusing on what is necessary for comfort, security, and daily survival. He argued that this short-sightedness is not simply a result of social conditioning, but an inherent aspect of female nature, shaped by biological and evolutionary pressures. According to him, women are less likely to engage in planning for the distant future or to pursue grand ideals, preferring instead to address the challenges and opportunities that arise in their immediate environment. He saw this tendency as a limitation, suggesting that it prevented women from achieving greatness or contributing to the progress of society in meaningful ways. For Schopenhauer, the focus on the here and now was a defining characteristic of women, reinforcing his broader critique of their intellectual and creative potential. Number 7. Unambitious. Schopenhauer claimed that women inherently lacked the ambition for greatness, invention, or leaving a lasting legacy. He argued that, unlike men, women are not driven by a desire to achieve fame, recognition, or historical significance. In his view, women are more content with the present and the personal, finding fulfillment in relationships, family, and immediate surroundings. Schopenhauer believed that this lack of ambition was not simply a matter of choice or circumstance, but a fundamental aspect of female nature. He maintained that women are less inclined to pursue challenging or risky endeavors, preferring instead to focus on security and stability. This perspective led him to conclude that women are unlikely to make significant contributions to art, science, or philosophy, as these fields require a relentless pursuit of excellence and a willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for the sake of achievement. For Schopenhauer, the absence of ambition was a defining characteristic of women, reinforcing his broader critique of their intellectual and creative potential. Number 8. Instability. Schopenhauer described women as emotionally unstable and lacking the self-control he considered essential for higher reasoning and moral strength. He argued that women are more prone to mood swings, impulsive reactions, and emotional outbursts, which, in his view, undermine their ability to make rational decisions. According to Schopenhauer, this emotional volatility is not simply a product of upbringing or environment, but an intrinsic part of female nature. He believed that women's feelings often override their judgment, making them less reliable in situations that require calm deliberation or steady resolve. This perceived instability, he claimed, affects not only personal relationships, but also women's capacity to participate in intellectual or public life. For Schopenhauer, the lack of emotional self-mastery was a significant limitation, reinforcing his argument that women are less suited to positions of responsibility or authority. This belief further justified his broader view of women as fundamentally different from, and inferior to, men in matters of intellect and character. Number 9. Dependence. Schopenhauer maintained that women are naturally dependent on men for protection and provision, viewing this dependence as a fundamental aspect of female nature. He argued that throughout history and across cultures, women have relied on men to provide physical safety, financial support, and social stability. In his perspective, this reliance was not merely a result of social structures or limited opportunities, but a reflection of inherent biological and psychological traits. Schopenhauer believed that women, being physically weaker and more vulnerable, instinctively seek out men who can offer security and resources. This dependence, he claimed, shapes women's choices in relationships, family life, and even their ambitions. Rather than striving for independence or self-sufficiency, women are portrayed as prioritizing the formation of bonds with strong, capable men. For Schopenhauer, this natural inclination toward dependence justified traditional gender roles and reinforced his broader argument that women are fundamentally different from men in both character and capability. Number 10. Amorality. Schopenhauer believed that women were less capable of abstract moral reasoning, suggesting they were more driven by personal feelings and immediate circumstances than by universal ethical principles. He argued that women's moral compass was often guided by empathy and compassion, but lacked the capacity for detached, objective judgment. In his view, this limitation made women less able to grasp complex moral dilemmas or to apply consistent, ethical standards across different situations. Schopenhauer claimed that women's moral decisions were often influenced by their relationships with others, particularly family and loved ones, leading them to prioritize personal loyalty over abstract notions of justice or fairness. This perspective led him to conclude that women were less suited to roles that required impartial decision-making or the application of abstract moral principles, such as law, politics, or philosophy. For Schopenhauer, the perceived lack of abstract moral reasoning was a significant flaw, reinforcing his broader critique of women's intellectual and ethical capacities. Number 11. Calculating. Schopenhauer posited that women often use affection as a calculated tool for securing stability and resources, rather than experiencing genuine, selfless love. He argued that women's expressions of love and attachment are frequently motivated by desire for security, financial support, and social status, rather than by deep emotional connection or spiritual affinity. In his view, women are adept at feigning affection to attract and retain partners who can provide them with the material and social advantages they seek. Schopenhauer believed that this calculating approach to relationships was not necessarily malicious or intentional, but rather a natural consequence of women's biological and social roles. He saw women as being primarily concerned with ensuring their own survival and well-being, and using affection as a means to achieve these ends. This perspective led him to view romantic relationships with cynicism, suggesting that they are often based on self-interest and strategic manipulation rather than genuine emotional connection. Number 12. Unfit. Schopenhauer argued that women were inherently unfit for leadership roles in politics, law, or philosophy. He believed that the qualities required for effective leadership, such as rational judgment, decisiveness, and the ability to remain objective under pressure, were lacking in women due to their emotional nature and focus on immediate concerns. According to Schopenhauer, women's instincts and priorities made them more suited to managing domestic affairs and nurturing relationships, rather than guiding the broader direction of society or engaging in complex intellectual debates. He maintained that women's tendency to prioritize personal connections and emotional well-being over abstract principles or long-term goals limited their capacity to make impartial decisions for the greater good. This perspective led him to oppose the idea of women participating in public life or holding positions of authority, reinforcing traditional gender roles and justifying the exclusion of women from spheres of influence that, in his view, demanded qualities they did not possess. Number 13. Weakness. Schopenhauer believed that women possessed inherently weaker willpower than men and were more easily swayed by their desires and emotions. He argued that this lack of inner strength made women less capable of resisting temptation or persevering through hardship. In his view, women were more likely to act on impulse, allowing fleeting feelings or immediate gratifications to dictate their choices rather than exercising discipline or self-control. Schopenhauer saw this perceived weakness as a fundamental flaw, one that limited women's ability to achieve greatness or maintain consistent moral standards. He maintained that women's decisions were often shaped by changing moods and external influences, making them unreliable in situations that required steadfastness or sacrifice. This belief reinforced his broader argument that women were less suited to positions of responsibility or authority, as he considered strong willpower and the ability to master one's desires essential qualities for leadership, intellectual achievement, and moral integrity. Number 14. Materialism. Schopenhauer accused women of being excessively preoccupied with material comfort and personal security. He argued that women's priorities are fundamentally shaped by desire for stability, luxury, and the assurance of their own well-being. In his view, this focus on materialism is not simply a product of social conditioning, but an intrinsic aspect of female nature, rooted in evolutionary drives for survival and protection. Schopenhauer believed that women are more likely to value wealth, status, and the comforts of life, often seeking partners who can provide these advantages. He saw this tendency as evidence of a practical, but ultimately limited, worldview, one that prioritizes immediate needs and tangible benefits over abstract ideals or higher aspirations. According to Schopenhauer, this materialistic orientation prevents women from engaging deeply with intellectual, artistic, or spiritual pursuits, reinforcing his broader critique that women are more concerned with the surface realities of life than with its deeper meanings or possibilities. Number 15. Conformity. Schopenhauer saw women as especially prone to conformity, believing they were more likely than men to follow social trends and yield to external pressures. He argued that women's sense of identity and self-worth was closely tied to the approval and acceptance of their peers and community. In his view, this tendency to conform was not merely a result of upbringing or societal expectations, but an inherent aspect of female psychology. Schopenhauer claimed that women are naturally more attuned to the moods, opinions, and standards of those around them, making them eager to fit in and avoid standing out. This inclination, he believed, led women to prioritize fashion, etiquette, and popular opinion over independent thought or personal conviction. For Schopenhauer, such conformity was a sign of weakness, preventing women from developing original ideas or challenging the status quo, and reinforcing his broader argument that women were less suited to leadership or creative innovation. Number 16. Unoriginality. Schopenhauer claimed that women lacked creativity and originality, particularly in the realms of art, science, and philosophy. He argued that, while women might excel in practical or decorative tasks, they rarely produced groundbreaking ideas or works that advanced human knowledge or culture. In his view, the female mind was more inclined toward imitation and adaptation rather than genuine innovation. Schopenhauer believed that the greatest achievements in literature, music, painting, and scientific discovery were almost exclusively the domain of men, attributing this disparity to what he saw as an inherent limitation in women's intellectual and imaginative capacities. He maintained that women were more likely to follow established patterns and conventions, rather than challenge norms or pursue bold, original visions. This perceived lack of creative genius reinforced his broader critique of women's role in society, justifying their exclusion from the highest levels of artistic and intellectual endeavor and supporting traditional gender hierarchies. Number 17. Indirectness. Schopenhauer expressed strong dislike for the way he believed women wielded power through subtlety and indirect means rather than open confrontation or direct action. He argued that, instead of asserting themselves plainly, women often influenced outcomes behind the scenes, using suggestion, persuasion, and emotional leverage to shape decisions. In his view, this indirect approach to power was not a sign of cleverness or diplomacy, but rather a reflection of an unwillingness or inability to engage in straightforward competition. Schopenhauer saw this as a form of manipulation, where women achieved their aims without taking responsibility or exposing themselves to risk. He believed that such tactics undermined transparency and honesty in relationships and society at large. For Schopenhauer, the preference for indirect influence was an inherent aspect of female nature, reinforcing his broader critique that women's methods of gaining power were fundamentally different from, and in his eyes, less admirable than, those of men. Number 18. Instrumentality. Schopenhauer viewed women primarily as agents of nature, whose main purpose was to ensure the continuation of the species through reproduction. He argued that women's instincts, desires, and behaviors were fundamentally shaped by nature's imperative to propagate life. In his philosophy, women were seen less as independent individuals and more as instruments serving biological necessity. Schopenhauer believed that this role as nature's agent influenced every aspect of a woman's existence, from her focus on security and nurturing to her choices in relationships and family life. He maintained that women's priorities, such as seeking protection, stability, and suitable partners, were all rooted in the drive to bear and raise children. This perspective led him to view women's contributions to society as limited to their reproductive and nurturing functions, reinforcing his belief that their capacities and ambitions were inherently different from those of men. For Schopenhauer, this instrumentality defined the boundaries of women's roles and potential. Number 19. Uninspired. Schopenhauer believed that women were fundamentally uninterested in higher culture, lofty ideals, or spiritual pursuits. He argued that women's attention was naturally drawn to the practical and immediate aspects of life, rather than to the abstract or transcendent. In his view, women were less likely to engage with philosophy, art, or religion on a deep level, seeing such endeavors as irrelevant to their daily concerns. Schopenhauer maintained that this lack of interest was not simply a result of limited education or opportunity, but an inherent aspect of female nature. He claimed that women were more concerned with tangible realities, such as family, comfort, and social standing, than with the pursuit of wisdom, beauty, or spiritual enlightenment. This perspective led him to conclude that women were less capable of contributing to the intellectual and cultural advancement of society, reinforcing his broader argument that their aspirations and achievements were confined to the material and the mundane. Number 20. Resentment. Schopenhauer's views on women were deeply colored by his own personal experiences and resentments. Throughout his life, he had several negative encounters with women, most notably with his mother, Johanna Schopenhauer, who was a successful writer and socialite. Their relationship was fraught with conflict, and Schopenhauer often felt misunderstood and dismissed by her. Additionally, his romantic relationships were marked by disappointment and frustration, further fueling his skepticism and bitterness. These personal grievances contributed to the harshness and intensity of his philosophical arguments against women. Rather than viewing his opinions as purely objective or detached, it is clear that Schopenhauer's writings were shaped by a sense of personal injury and emotional pain. This resentment manifested in his tendency to generalize his negative experiences, projecting them onto women as a whole. As a result, his philosophy on gender is often seen as not only controversial, but also deeply subjective and emotionally charged. Number 21. Frailty. Schopenhauer considered women to be physically weaker and less suited to endure hardship compared to men. He argued that this physical frailty was not just a matter of individual variation, but a fundamental difference rooted in biology. According to Schopenhauer, women's bodies were designed primarily for childbearing and nurturing, rather than for strength, endurance, or resilience in the face of adversity. He believed that this inherent weakness limited women's ability to participate in demanding activities, whether in work, exploration, or conflict. In his view, women's physical limitations justified their exclusion from roles that required stamina, courage, or the capacity to withstand significant stress. Schopenhauer saw this as another reason why women were naturally dependent on men for protection and support. For him, the physical differences between the sexes were not only undeniable but also reinforced his broader argument that women were less suited to positions of authority, leadership, or independence. Number 22. Subjectivity. Schopenhauer believed that women were less capable of objective, detached thinking, a quality he considered essential for intellectual and philosophical achievement. He argued that women's perspectives were inherently subjective, shaped by personal feelings, relationships, and immediate circumstances rather than by impartial analysis or abstract reasoning. In his view, this subjectivity limited women's ability to engage in critical thinking or to approach problems with the necessary distance and neutrality. Schopenhauer maintained that women were more likely to let emotions influence their judgments, making them less reliable in situations that demanded fairness or rational deliberation. He saw this tendency as a fundamental aspect of female nature, not simply a result of upbringing or social conditioning. For Schopenhauer, the inability to detach from personal interests and emotions reinforced his belief that women were unsuited for roles in philosophy, science, or leadership, where objectivity and the capacity for dispassionate thought were, in his mind, indispensable. Number 23. Gossip. Schopenhauer accused women of being especially prone to gossip and social intrigue, viewing these behaviors as central to female social life. He argued that women, more than men, are drawn to the exchange of personal information, rumors, and secrets, using conversation as a means of influence and control within their social circles. In his view, this tendency toward gossip was not merely a harmless pastime, but a reflection of women's focus on relationships, status, and social maneuvering. Schopenhauer believed that women's interest in the affairs of others often led to the creation of cliques, rivalries, and subtle power struggles, all conducted through indirect communication rather than open confrontation. He saw this as evidence of a preference for subtlety and emotional manipulation over straightforwardness. For Schopenhauer, the inclination toward gossip and intrigue reinforced his broader critique of women's character, suggesting that their social interactions were often motivated by self-interest and a desire for influence. Number 24. Inconsistency. Schopenhauer often portrayed women as inconsistent in their opinions and affections, suggesting they were prone to sudden shifts in mood and loyalty. He argued that women's feelings and beliefs were easily swayed by external influences, making them unreliable as allies or confidants. In his view, this inconsistency was not simply a matter of individual temperament, but a fundamental aspect of female nature, rooted in their emotional volatility and susceptibility to social pressures. Schopenhauer believed that women were more likely to change their minds based on fleeting impressions or personal relationships, rather than adhering to fixed principles or long-term commitments. This perceived lack of steadfastness led him to question their capacity for genuine friendship, loyalty, or self-sacrifice. For Schopenhauer, the inconsistency in women's opinions and affections reinforced his broader critique of their character, suggesting that they were less dependable and less capable of sustained commitment than men. Number 25. Naivety. Schopenhauer described women as inherently more childlike, naive, and less mature than men, both emotionally and intellectually. He argued that women possess a youthful innocence that persists throughout their lives, making them more impressionable and less capable of critical judgment. In his view, this naivety was not simply a result of limited experience or education, but a fundamental aspect of female nature. Schopenhauer believed that women's outlook on life was shaped by a sense of wonder and simplicity, which, while sometimes endearing, also rendered them more susceptible to deception and manipulation. He maintained that this childlike quality limited women's ability to navigate complex situations or to engage in serious philosophical or moral reflection. For Schopenhauer, the perceived lack of maturity in women justified their exclusion from positions of authority and responsibility, reinforcing his broader argument that women were fundamentally different from men in both character and capability. Number 26. Distractibility. Schopenhauer argued that women were easily distracted and less able to maintain focus on complex or demanding tasks. He believed that women's attention was naturally drawn to immediate surroundings, social interactions, and practical concerns, making it difficult for them to concentrate on abstract or challenging work for extended periods. In his view, this distractibility was not simply a result of upbringing or lack of education, but an inherent aspect of female nature. Schopenhauer maintained that women were more likely to abandon difficult projects in favor of more accessible or enjoyable activities, lacking the perseverance required for significant intellectual or creative achievement. He saw this tendency as a major limitation, preventing women from excelling in fields that demanded sustained effort, deep concentration, or long-term commitment. For Schopenhauer, the inability to focus on difficult tasks reinforced his broader argument that women were less suited to scholarly, artistic, or professional pursuits that required discipline and endurance. Number 27. Superficiality. Schopenhauer claimed that women lacked spiritual depth and showed little interest in metaphysical questions or the deeper mysteries of existence. He argued that women were primarily concerned with the tangible and practical aspects of daily life, rarely engaging with abstract ideas or seeking answers to profound philosophical questions. In his view, this superficiality was not merely a consequence of limited education or opportunity, but a fundamental aspect of female nature. Schopenhauer believed that women were less likely to be drawn to religion, philosophy, or the pursuit of wisdom for its own sake, focusing instead on immediate needs and personal relationships. He saw this lack of spiritual curiosity as a significant limitation, preventing women from contributing meaningfully to the intellectual and cultural advancement of society. For Schopenhauer, the absence of metaphysical interest reinforced his broader critique that women were more concerned with surface realities than with the deeper truths that define human existence. Number 28. Vanity. Schopenhauer saw women as excessively vain, arguing that they placed an inordinate amount of importance on their appearance and external beauty. He believed that women's self-worth was closely tied to how they were perceived by others, particularly by men, and that this preoccupation with looks overshadowed other qualities or achievements. In his view, vanity was not simply a social construct or the result of cultural pressures, but an inherent aspect of female nature, rooted in evolutionary drives to attract and secure a mate. Schopenhauer maintained that women devoted significant time and energy to fashion, grooming, and maintaining their attractiveness, often at the expense of intellectual or moral development. He saw this focus on appearance as evidence of superficiality and a limited worldview, reinforcing his belief that women were more concerned with fleeting, external validation than with lasting personal growth or accomplishment. For Schopenhauer, vanity was a defining and limiting trait of the female character. Number 29. Unreliability. Schopenhauer believed that women were fundamentally unreliable when it came to friendship, loyalty, and self-sacrifice. He argued that women's relationships were often based on self-interest, emotional manipulation, and social maneuvering, rather than on genuine affection or unwavering commitment. In his view, women were more likely to prioritize their own needs and desires, or those of their immediate family, over the well-being of friends or the pursuit of higher ideals. Schopenhauer maintained that women lacked the capacity for the kind of selfless devotion and unwavering loyalty that he considered essential for true friendship or heroic action. He saw this unreliability as a significant flaw, limiting women's ability to form deep, meaningful connections or to contribute to the greater good. For Schopenhauer, the perceived lack of steadfastness in women's relationships reinforced his broader critique of their character, suggesting that they were less dependable and less capable of sustained commitment than men. Number 30. Selfishness. Schopenhauer believed that women were incapable of true self-sacrifice or acts of heroism, viewing their actions as ultimately motivated by self-interest or the welfare of their immediate family. He argued that while women might appear nurturing or caring, their willingness to help others rarely extended beyond their own circle or came at significant personal cost. In his view, women's instincts for self-preservation and security outweighed any inclination toward altruism or noble deeds. Schopenhauer maintained that the capacity for genuine heroism, risking one's own well-being for a higher cause or for the good of strangers, was a trait found predominantly in men. He saw this as a fundamental limitation, reinforcing his belief that women were less suited to roles that demanded courage, sacrifice, or dedication to ideals beyond themselves. For Schopenhauer, the absence of true self-sacrifice in women's character was yet another reason to question their suitability for positions of responsibility or moral leadership.